Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of the Gate Guys podcast. It is, it's January the 29th. Oh my gosh, we got a little behind here, but hey, you guys always know we've been doing this for several years. We take a little bit of time off over the holidays there, and things admittedly did extend a little further than we'd like here into January. But the good news is that we've got 3 or 4 podcasts in the hopper here. We did continue to record, but the editing process at times can be a little bit tedious. I've moved over to Audacity from just using the easy way out on GarageBand and having a little bit more functionality and higher options and more abilities to funnel out some noise distortion and background noise and stuff on Audacity. So the learning curve isn't where I want it to be. You can use Audacity very simply, but I'm trying to I've got some new projects coming down the road, as do Ivo and I, and I'm trying to make sure that I understand this at a reasonable level, because learning curves, once you get them down, they're good. But if you kind of, as in all things in life, if you kind of take the easy road, you get used to using the easy road all the time. But if you kind of do things right the first time, you don't have to do them a second time. I'm reminded that, my dad would always go out on the lawn after I cut the lawn, and he'd say, "Get out the lawn more, son." And I'd be like, "Dad, I just cut the lawn." He goes, "Yeah, you kind of cut the lawn." And he'd always say, if you had time to do it right a second time, you had time to do it right the first time around. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. So in that, I'll throw in a little bit of procrastination and some busyness into the new year here, and we got behind. But the good thing is we're still here. We're back. We've got another great show lined up for you. Giving you this little heads up because we do mention some dates in here, and they are in December when we recorded these in and around the holidays there. So don't be alarmed when you hear the dates thinking you've missed all kinds of podcasts. You have not. The last one I think we did was a running cadence there in December. So you're right on track with things. This is, I think, number 118. So we've got a great show lined up. As always, we've got some new things coming down the pipeline. We've let a sponsor or two go because, for various reasons. It doesn't really matter. We still believe in their products, but as all things, relationships come to an end at times, and it's time to move forward. And so we're going to go a couple shows, maybe 1 or 2, sponsor-free. And we've reached out to some new companies that I know and Ivo knows that you guys all use. And we're starting some dialogue with them. We'll see if we can pull them in. If we could get these guys on as sponsors, it would be fantastic, especially if we could get you guys a little discount code. So no promises. These are big heavy hitters, and we know that they do other shows as well. As always, it's trying to get companies that are germane to what we do and what you do, which is athletics and running and movement and training and stuff like that. So at some point, we've been approached by a few companies that are outside of that realm. We may bring them on just to help pay for some of the servers and all the things that we have to do here to try and keep this going, including accountants and taxes and everything else. So there's a little bit more to it here at the Gate Guys than just throwing up the odd post over at our website, thegateguys.com, or Facebook, social media and stuff. So it's always easy to think that that's all there is, but there's a lot more behind the game here. And if you go into our website and look at all the things that we're doing, including our stores and teaching and stuff, you'll realize that there's probably some back-end costs. But anyways, you guys don't want to hear this stuff. Let's move forward. Great podcast lined up here. 2017 is going to be a good year for Ivo and I. We've got some great stuff that we are planning that you do not know about, but you will shortly. He and I are going to be on the line in the next week discussing some things. And, the bottom line is, hint, hint, more of Ivo and Sean on a couple different levels. So hang tight for that. Listen, we're going to put a little bass riff here on the other end here. Get you right into the podcast. No commercials. All right, we're back for another podcast. Sean Allen here in Chicago, and I've got the notorious Dr. Ivo Werlop right here on the other line. We're just going to go right into the podcast today. And I will put up something that got a lot of attention on Facebook this week. And so I just thought we would maybe chat a little bit about that and maybe go a little deeper, or, let's see what he has to think about. What'd you put up, and what kind of things rang some bells?
So on December 12th, we put up a post and it was a video. And it was basically the low back screening that you and I use a lot in our offices, talking about subtle pelvic shifts, drifts, looking at hypertonicity in the lumbar spine, as well as doing sort of a standing modified multifidus lift test, looking for, that contralateral stability quotient. And we had a lot of interest evidently in it, because, 20,000 plus shares. I'm sorry, not shares, but views with, 60 or 70 shares, something like that. But one of the things here was talking about the center of gravity shift. So a lot of times when we're watching people stand up and we have them stand on one leg, we're looking for less shift of the pelvis to the weight-bearing side. We call that a pelvic drift or a pelvic cruise. And it was brought about. So shifting to the side of support, COG, isn't a dysfunction, ? Well, it can be a dysfunction, and a lot of that's going to depend upon how wide apart the feet are. So the way I like to do it, and I'm fairly certain you do it this way as well, is we have people stand. First we have them, can they stand with their eyes open on just one leg? And when they do stand on one leg, do they have a shift to one side or the other? And usually it's to the weight-bearing side to bring that center of gravity over the foot. Well, the idea is the more pelvic control that you have, so the more skill, endurance, and strength you have in your hip musculature, as well as, competency of your articulations and things like that, generally speaking, the stronger or better, if you want to use that word, your core musculature is. And then as people improve, they should be able to have their feet further and further apart and show less and less pelvic shift, if any, when going from side to side. Is that kind of how you do it, or?
It is. It is fraught with a lot of flaws if you don't know what you're looking at. But go on, and I'll interject as you move on.
No, that was one of the main things that sort of came out of it. There was a lot of discussion between, many different people talking about that. And another point came up that we'll talk about in just a second here. But shifting to the side of support, I don't want to necessarily say is totally dysfunctional. It can be expected, again, depending upon, 1, the valgus angle, 2, the amount of, varus and valgus in the feet, 3, the amount of pelvic strength, et cetera. And you're going to compare that with your walking evaluation. But we sort of use it as a continuum. So if they can stand and there's no pelvic shift, then they're stronger. Now we move the feet maybe an inch or 2 apart. We try the same thing again, and continue to go and see how far out we can get people ultimately to go before they have a pelvic shift. So anyway, that was interesting. The other thing was somebody had written in that they weren't, the comment was the sacroiliac joint has minimal movement, so it's highly unlikely that you can palpate subtle movement like that. And I had to disagree with that statement. There's a lot of research out there. Egond is one that I like to cite, but there's others as well that talks about the sacroiliac joint having 2 to 3 millimeters of movement. In general, you can definitely palpate 2 to 3 millimeters of movement, whether that be nutation or extension of the posterior superior iliac spine when you're doing like a modified Gillet test when people are standing on one leg. It's been pretty, I believe that there's a number of studies. I'd have to go delve into the literature to actually get the citations, but looking at, inter-examiner reliability of like the Gillet test and the standing test. I know the Motion Palpation Institute came out with a lot of that stuff back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So anyway, the other thing was somebody was said, I wasn't aware you could palpate the multifidus. And what I did is I just brought up the paper out of PubMed. Then we talked about this paper probably 6 months ago on the pod, talking about the multifidus lift test and a modified multifidus lift test, which was originally published in, trying to remember here for a second, Spine, which, kind of validated that importance. So it was good. Lots of good hits on it, lots of interest. It's always nice when we get questions that people ask or points that are brought up, because that's how I learn, as to, questioning some of the things that we put up or whatever. And I think that that's good because, one, it keeps us on our toes. And number two, it's good because sometimes it's like, well, and you don't know if the person asking the question represents the cross-section of people out there, but it's like, wow, people need to know this, and perhaps they don't know this. And what a lot of times I think maybe some of us clinicians that deal with this kind of stuff on a daily basis think of as just sort of common knowledge. Other people as totally new information.
Yeah, the test itself, I mean, this is one of those things. It's a skilled assessment, and over a period of years, these subtle skilled things become perceptible. And so I can understand where they're coming from in thinking that it's too small of a movement, but not under a skilled practitioner. You say 2 or 3 millimeters. Yeah, that's perceptible, but it almost becomes a test more on what's the quality of movement as opposed to the quantity of movement. So that's one factor. And if you don't know what we're talking about, just go and watch the video. It's over on Facebook. It's all probably already on our blog. If not, it will be. But it's a valuable test, but it's a test that if you don't know what you're observing and you don't know to observe all of the factors, the test can be very unreliable and it can be misleading. And as you said, I mean, if the patient has poor single leg balance work, they're going to create a massive pelvic shift to try and get the center of the body, upper body mass over top of that foot, the fixation point. So if there are some foot challenges, some ankle sprains, some painful knees, or if you've got tibial varum or genuvarum, these factors are all going to play into how much shift in the frontal plane the person needs to move in order to move from a double leg stance to a single leg stance. In many respects, it's almost a test of their ability to find a skilled pattern. If you don't engage the glute medius, in other words, if you're looking at if someone had a belt on, you're looking at their belt line, and if they shifted from both feet onto the right foot and you didn't see that pelvis height change a little bit, you're probably going to shift more than if you actually got into the glute medius on the stance phase leg and created a little bit of a hip hike on the leg that's in the air. And so one way to reduce the amount of frontal plane shift is to go into a stance phase hip hike on the side that you're standing on. That will reduce the amount of shift, which turns it into a very skilled movement because that's what should be happening. As we've said, the glutes, max, med, min, are how it's supposed to stabilize that pelvis on the stance phase leg, and on the swing phase leg, you're supposed to have some QL and abdominal contraction in order to stabilize the pelvis. So if you don't have that pattern, which is in fact what you talked about on the exam, you're going to have more of a frontal plane shift. So again, it's more than just a multifidus test. It's more than just can you feel the glute firing? It's how's the quality of the movement? How's your single leg balance testing? What other variables in torsional bony formations are you dealing with? So there's a lot of variables here. And so that's why that test is quite frequently, I think, misinterpreted or or skewed wrongly in an evaluation process, and I've seen it. But you and I both know that when you do this test, if you're looking at all those parameters in 5 seconds, you got the information that you need, and you probably have been able to then perceive the amount of motion in the joint, quality and quantity in the SI joint itself, as well as some assessment of the glute medius and the QL and the multifidi and all those things. So it's an infinitely valuable test, not only for the joint and the pelvis and the hip, but also for their skilled patterns of how they're going to be moving through space. Because if you think about it, gait is one leg on the foot at a time while the other's in the air, and so is running. So there is this, single leg support phase in these activities. So that's kind of what you're testing here. So I liked the video. It was just a confirmation of the things that I do. I did see some empty holes in it because it's frankly, you can't sit there and talk about that test for 15 minutes in a lecture, but some of them did come up in the questions, and I think you covered it beautifully. So I hope folks will go ahead and have a look at that test and at least get familiar with it, knowing that there's a lot of variables there. So you got to know what you're talking about. So,
that was actually, that particular screening was out of a dry needling seminar that I was teaching, and that's just one small portion of a 25-hour weekend. And that's just sort of giving people a window because we try to always add in a lot of clinical information. We talked about the SI joint too. I want to say, gosh, it was probably 6 months ago. There was an interesting paper in the Journal of Anatomy by Art Vleeming, one of our faves as far as people that have written. We've got the reference there, and if Sean can, he'll put that in the show notes for you as well. It's a full text-free article. You may want to check that one out. I know when we ran that originally, and it was probably 6 months ago, we had lots and lots of action on that particular paper. It's really a landmark paper and goes through all the current literature and sort of the state of the art about the SI joint. And the test isn't just about the sacroiliac joint. It's really about how the entire system moves. And if you want to try a little experiment, what you can do is do this standing test. Very simple. You're standing behind your patient or whoever you want to test. You have them have their eyes open and eyes closed, just basically stand, raise one leg up to approximately 90 degrees, then have them do the same test again with a foot tripod, in other words, dorsiflexing the toes. And then what you can start doing is start messing around with, first of all, just look at them, what's the position of their cervical spine, etc. Then you can have them laterally bend their head, you can have them rotate to one side, and by activating different muscle groups, you start to realize the complexity, like you were talking about, of all the different factors going in. One of the first things I do when I'm doing something with manual muscle testing, and we had a post, I believe it was last week. This is December 16th that we're recording this. Looking at some of the testing of muscle function of the glute. And I believe we talked about this on our last podcast where we had, portions of the glute max and the glute med can actually be internal rotators of the thigh. I totally lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay.
Does that ever happen to you?
Usually on Friday afternoons.
As far as that. Actually, no. What I was meaning to say is we learn the complexity there, and when we start to move the cervical spine around, now we get all the complexity of involving the vestibular system. So we get the semicircular canals involved in different portions of the cerebellum, and then all of a sudden it becomes way more complex. And when somebody's on the table, and that's what I was meaning to say, and we're performing any kind of manual muscle testing, an open chain, and we're going to compare that to closed chain, I'm always looking at the position of what's their head. Is their head in flexion? Is it in neutral? Is it in extension? Are they rotating their head to the right? Do they have their arm flexed on one side? And that's why when we're testing people, and I know you're a stickler for this as well, you really want to make sure that you're consistent with how that patient positioning is and the way you perform the test. That way you're going to get much better reliability.
Yeah, one of the the problems with manual muscle testing is the patients are always wanting to be engaged in the process. They're always tilting their head to one side to have a peek at you and what you're doing. I'm always saying, look, head straight, look straight up at the ceiling. And so, yeah, another variable there that's often missed. But if you've read of a lot of our stuff on the crossover gait, which has kind of been one of our soapboxes to rant from, you need to go ahead and look at this video, and you need to go back and listen to the first 10 minutes of this podcast again, because someone who has a crossover gait needs this assessment and all the stuff that we talked about, the ability to hip hike and get into your core and stabilize. This is a good assessment breaking down that movement pattern. I wouldn't say it's exactly a correction, and it's not a all-encompassing assessment, but it's giving you pieces of variables to assess in your client. And obviously, if someone has a weak glute medius and a weak core on the stance side, you're going to have too much frontal plane drifting, and they're going to tend to be more of a crossover type runner. And we have spoken about this, crossover isn't a bad thing if you have enough durability, to hang out in that posture. And if you don't have enough durability and you start to fatigue somewhere in the run, now that becomes a liability and injuries start to ensue. So go back and look at that. And if you're a crossover freak like we are, go ahead and have a look. So we kind of, so we kind of jumped over our typical itinerary just because, it's good to change things around. We're going to jump into a couple little neuroscience pieces here, because keeping you guys abreast of what's going on in the neuroscience world, especially in movement, is kind of what we do here. And this is kind of one that's a little close to the hearts of both of us, because we've both been through some stuff here with gut problems, and Parkinson's disease is another movement disorder. And this one's in the news. Parkinson's is linked to gut bacteria. And we'll have the link in the show notes. It's from CNBC, but they do quote the article from... actually, I don't remember where that was from, but they were looking at Parkinson's disease here, and the issues of beneficial bacteria and those types of things in these clients with Parkinson's, and they found some rather startling findings. What did you think of this study? This was pretty important, I think, and it's where things are going to be moving as we move forward here in terms of science and nutrition and whatnot. So,
well, the link between Parkinsonism and the gut really has been around for quite a long time. As far as things go, there's a paper back that I remember in 2008 in the Neurogastroenterology and Motility talking about the clinical association between gut motility issues as well as Parkinson's disease. And there's been a number of papers that have come out just in the last 2 years that talk a lot about vagal nerve function, which the vagus nerve, remember the 10th cranial nerve, innervates your entire intestinal tract pretty much up to the middle of the transverse colon. And the link between the two is, compelling. And now we're starting to see more papers. And this is one. This was off the CNBC feed that we look at. Looking at the gut microbiome. And gee, why shouldn't the gut microbiome be involved with Parkinson's disease? Because it's involved with pretty much every other inflammatory process that we know that's going on. And when we have something going on, we look at the gut microbiome of people with Parkinson's, it's distinctly different than somebody who does not have Parkinson's. And I'm especially interested in this because I've got patients which are Parkinson's patients and folks that I know close to me that are suffering from Parkinsonism or Parkinson's disease as well. So anything that can be done to kind of help that. And one of the things we find is, one, changing out the diet and things like that can make an enormous difference, an enormous impact on how these individuals feel. 2, exercise can. 3, manipulation. 4, acupuncture. And the studies go on and on. In fact, I believe we posted a video, it was probably a year ago now, looking at Parkinsonism and conservative management nutrition. And we can repost that again, or at least a link to that on the page if that's something that people want to look at. It's just basically to conservative management stuff there. But very, very interesting. And Sean and I, of course, are interested in Parkinson's for a lot of reasons. Not only the neurological perspective, but 2, the gait perspective, and looking at what's creating these things and what sort of changes we can make in these people's lives. But interesting. And the CNBC feed's pretty cursory as far as what they talk about, but really it's not much of a stretch. Just like the link between gut microbiome and obesity. We're finding now that certain beneficial bacteria are wiped out and other bacteria are taking over. So really seeing this change here, because we believe Parkinson's is probably a inflammatory disorder, is not that surprising. So.
Yeah, and it really just comes down to a lot of the stuff that you and I preach on a regular basis in our office, with just good health hygiene habits. And it's about eating your good prebiotic foods and fibers and stuff like that. And there are other supplements out there that actually will help you increase that prebiotic food source to the good bacteria in the gut. A bad diet is going to throw down all of the poor nutrients to help feed the healthy bacteria, which is what offsets some of that growth. So you're going to need a good probiotic as well, and you're going to want to, your fermented foods, and your kombuchas and your kefirs, and your sauerkraut and stuff like that. So if that stuff's not in your diet, your gut may not be as healthy as you think it is, and nobody wants these neurodegenerative types of diseases. So if it's in your family, it's time to start cleaning up that diet and getting better gut health going. So we'll just leave it at that.
And just a really quick, because I know you do a fair amount of, nutritional stuff, not necessarily, we're not nutritionists, but we give people a lot of advice in our office. But boy, what you had mentioned about fermented foods is just so much there, so much better. And if you can't get fermented foods in your diet for a specific region, maybe you have candida overgrowth or, SIBO or something like that. And even they know in cases now that fermented foods can be good for those things of the right quality and quantity, but you get so much more bang for your buck. If you were to take 2 probiotic capsules, and most of those are going to have anywhere from 12 to 20 billion live organisms in them per day, you would get 10 to 12 times that amount in 1 tablespoon of sauerkraut.
Yep.
So fermented foods, kimchi, sauerkraut, kefir, any of those things that you like are way more bang for your buck as far as with fermented food.
And you want to make sure that if you're going the sauerkraut way, it's better to get the least processed. Bubby's comes to name. That's one trade name or one company name, Bubby's. I think it's just heat treated. It's not pasteurized and all of that other stuff. I don't know if I'm using the right terms here, but you've got to make sure that it's not overly processed. It's the fact to the point where, the bacteria are all killed off. So,
well, right. You don't want a pasteurized product because there won't be any beneficial bacteria in it.
Yeah.
That would kind of defeat the purpose,
Yeah, and I don't know if pasteurized is the right word, but Bubby's, I think they just heat treat the product to kill off the bad stuff. I'm not exactly sure. It says on the label, and it's been a while since I've read it, but to that point, I just buy the stuff now. I don't read the label anymore because I know it's good for you. So
that's it. So, now they have all these great flavors and stuff too. So.
Yeah, but don't underestimate, folks, the prebiotic. Everybody's on the probiotic thing, but there's a lot of prebiotic out there that you need to. There needs to be enough healthy fiber in order to break down into the nutrients that feed the good bacteria. So if you're just swallowing probiotics, but you're not giving them the proper food that they need, you're not going to have those bacteria flourish. In fact, they may be defeated by the unhealthy biome in the gut that's pre-existing your problem. So,
yeah. So maybe you know the answer to this question, Sean. Why do you remember? And you and I have been in practice long enough that we can say that. Do you remember when? Do you remember probiotics used to have a lot of fructooligosaccharides in them, which are basically prebiotics, and they discontinued doing that? Do you think that's just a sales move, or do you know of a reason?
I have no idea why, but I did notice that, and I think it was a mistake. But, I think maybe now they can sell separate products. I've got a product called Arabinex that I sell from Thorne in my office. That's a larch tree extract that has, it's just a very high potent prebiotic. But I don't know why they did that. I did notice that, and this stuff's very pure now. And there's nothing wrong with that, but now you got to add other stuff into it. And it might have been a marketing thing. I don't know.
Yeah, just curious.
Yep.
Anyway, that's enough. What did you think of this article originally out of Futurity? I actually pulled the Frontiers of Nutrition article to read through it about people who are runners, people who are active. And this is really the gist of the article. People who are active have more connections in their brain. I mean, I didn't really find this earth-shaking, did you?
No, I didn't at all. No, it's just nice to know that out of the frontiers in neuroscience, they actually did some MRI scans to prove their point here, which is always nice. It's nice to have something tangible to look at, and they basically were able to determine that there was greater functional connectivity in the brains of runners and very active people as composed to the sedentary. No surprise there, I guess, and it shouldn't be shocking that movement is medicine, which we say all the time. But it was just good to see that, and hopefully people are taking note of this stuff. There's so many sedentary people that are just not moving enough. You think an hour a day is enough movement, and frankly, I just don't believe that it is. But this study was talking about repetitive athletic activities and why they tended to hone in on runners as opposed to these more precise motor control type activities. They were talking about golf and musical instruments. All of these things stimulate these higher levels of brain function and coordination. But these repetitive athletic activities like running, that's just rote and repetitive. They have found that it involves many complex cognitive functions in the brain, a lot of executive function and decision making. So one of their thoughts was that, and I'll just quote it here, the areas of the brain where we saw more connectivity in
runners are also the areas that are impacted as we age. So it really raises the question of whether being active as a young adult could be potentially beneficial and perhaps afford some resilience against the effects of aging and disease. So, like you said, nothing earth-shattering, but we need to be moving more. And if you're a runner, you've got some advantages here.
Well, and if you think about the complexity of movement like you were talking about and all of the extra input that that's going to provide to the cerebellum, we need, axon collateralization and a neural adaptation to occur as a result of that. So we're going to get neuroplastic changes that are going to occur in the nervous system at both the central level as well as peripherally. And it's just a matter of, it's demand. Just like with a muscle, the more you exercise a muscle, the more demand there is for, one, energy stores, and two, blood supply. And then thirdly, a more efficient nervous innervation. And those things will develop over time. So it just makes sense that if you exercise, you're going to have more of those connections. And if we have more of those connections, as we start to age, we sort of have a buffer that's, now we haven't really, to my knowledge, looked too much at attrition of these connections yet, but you have more of a buffer. You're going to lose some of those synapses as you age. And if the normal person, let's say, has 100 and somebody who exercises has 1,000, now I've got this buffer of 900 that will help me to come down, and that's going to improve that whole quality of life. I think that's the gist of it. And that article feeds really nicely into the other article that you'd put in here about increasing muscle strength, improving brain function. What did you have to say about that? And then I had a couple comments.
Well, the only reason why I threw it in is just as you alluded to, that it parlayed nicely with the previous one. This one out of the Journal of American Geriatrics. And they just basically looked at increasing muscle strength in a client, and they attempted to prove and seems to suggest that it leads to improved brain function in adults with mild cognitive impairment, i.e. Alzheimer's and dementia and those types of things. So once again, the previous article was looking at repetitive activity and endurance type things, and this one was looking at muscle strength, also improves the cognitive function. And particularly in folks over 55, as this study suggested. The study, it took participants doing resistance exercise who were prescribed weightlifting sessions twice a week for 6 months, working to at least 80% of their peak strength. And as they got stronger, the amount of weight they lifted on each machine was increased to maintain that intensity at 80% of their peak strength. And they found some global cognition and cognitive improvements significantly after the resistance training, at which 12 months there were still some positive benefits. Things had not been completely attrition to the lack of training effect. So what did you think?
So the coolest thing for me about this article was the fact that resistance exercise was what made the difference, not aerobic training. So when you go and you actually, you look at the study that they actually did, it's out of Journal of American Geriatrics, it was resistance exercise that made the difference, which kind of blew me away a little bit, because I'm always thinking about oxygen and vasodilation and, increased cortical function with aerobic function and things like that. But it's actually the anaerobic group that actually showed the changes, not as much for the others, which led me to, of course, do a little bit of research. It's like, okay, well, the latest thing that everybody's seeming to talk about is high intensity interval training, and what effect does that have on cognitive decline or cognitive functioning? And I managed to find one paper that we'll put in the show notes for you, but just talking about resistance training and cognitive function in the elderly. And basically, the bottom line is the resistance training makes a large difference, but there are enough studies out there too that show that pretty much any kind of training, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic training, is going to make that. However, there's really no papers looking at the effect of high-intensity interval training in the elderly or other folks, at least that I'm aware of, on its effect on cognitive decline. So I thought that was interesting, and it's certainly an area for more research for us to kind of delve into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll try and keep this stuff coming, guys. It's why we keep this neuroscience stuff up. I think it's valid, and it's stuff that's going to be always in our face. So if we're not following it, you might get lost behind. And if you are following it, it's going to feel like you're just keeping up with the human experiment here. And on that note, experiments, the Nike, what are they calling it? The Breaking 2.
Oh, yeah, that was sort of interesting there. What is it called? Breaking 2, right?
Yeah, the Moonshot Marathon, as they're calling it, breaking the 2-hour marathon mark. And, I remember, I was born in 1967, so I'm 49 right now. And, back then, as I got a little bit older, some 20 years down the road, Roger Bannister was still being talked about, because he was the first guy to clock under 4 minutes in the mile. And Nike's now on this mission to next year see if that 2-hour mark can't be broken in the marathon. And it's interesting. I doubt that it's going to happen. The fastest one that's been run thus far is, what's that number? It's let's see, it's 2 hours, 2 minutes and 57 seconds. So 2 hours and 3 minutes. And so 3 minutes might not seem very much, but if you ask anybody who is running that fast, we're talking 13 miles an hour. These guys, Kometo, who is the one that, Dennis Kometo of Kenya, he's running 4:41 miles, 4 minutes, 41 second miles. I mean, are you kidding me? That's, we're just talking about in 1954, the guy that broke the 4-minute mile. That's just 1 mile. This guy's doing 4:41s over 26, give or take 26 miles. So we're talking about completely different times here. In it's almost millennial away from what we were talking about in 1954. And, at the end of the paper, what I thought was very interesting, they talked to Meb, one of the top American Olympians, and it was very interesting. He says that what I took was, and he wasn't saying no, but if you read between the lines, he says, look, there should be nobody at the elite level that should run a 3-minute personal record, which is what they're alluding to. Someone's going to run a 3-minute PR in order to break that 2-hour marathon. So he went on to say that at New York City Marathon, I ran a 2:09 10 times. And he asked the question why, and he said, because it's so hard to take off seconds, not minutes, but seconds when you're running that fast. So 3 minutes over 26 miles, when you're running that pace, almost at your human limit, it seems, at least to Meb, and I would have to agree, almost impossible. But again, we'll see. Nike's got this project, the Breaking 2, and they're going to try and basically perfect all of the conditions. They're going to have, fantastic pacers. They're going to have perfect environmental conditions, perfect terrain conditions. I mean, they're going to try and make sure that this thing is absolutely possible. And they're going to be working with, as I said in the article, designers and engineers, coaches, nutritionists, psychologists, physiologists, etc. I don't know if it's enough. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. You've got those limitations, and then you have equipment limitations, as far as shoes and things like that. And, are those things taken into account? You'd like to think that shoe engineers and designers take into account things like flex points of a shoe for toe break of a certain size and torsional rigidity components. But gosh, I mean, I know you do this all the time. I look at shoes all day long, and sometimes I just scratch my head and just say, what were they thinking here? It's like, why did they do this? And we see it in cleats all the time. And I know you do too. We did some work for an unnamed company a while ago where cleat placement was that was the reason that they were having all the injuries with this particular shoe. But you gotta kind of wonder. And then, there's the human factor, there's atmospheric factors that you have to consider, all these other things. My feeling is, yes, eventually at some point in time in the future that it'll happen. We'll have the sub 2. But I don't know if it's going to happen this year, maybe this decade. It depends. And I think a lot of it depends upon the individual and their individual physiology, as well as, where they're doing it and what the conditions are. So,
Yeah, this is the second time in probably the last 2 or 3 years that some article has brought up the 1991 Journal of Applied Physiology study by Michael Joyner, who is an expert in human performance at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. And it talks about the paper out of that Journal of Applied Physiology where he actually quoted that it might actually be physiologically possible to run a 1:57:58 marathon. So 1 hour, 57 minutes, 58 seconds. So, translate that 2 more seconds, a 1 hour, 58 minute marathon. So he's predicting that there are 5 minutes to give here between the 2:03 and what he says are the physiologic limits at 1:57 or 1:58. So I don't know. We will see. It's Nike's really sticking their neck out on this one, but it's not their first time doing it, and we'll see. I think if you can control enough of the variables and you get someone who is healthy, who has done the perfect training, who hasn't had any injuries, who's biomechanically sound, maybe he's got a tailwind, has some good pacers to help out, who knows? Anything is possible, but so many variables are going to have to be contained, including wind and temperature and a lot of things. But it'll be an interesting year to see if they can make this one happen.
Yeah, it certainly will. Like, anything can be possible, right? We're only limited by those beliefs that we place on ourselves, or limitations that we believe on or that we place on ourselves. But yeah, it'll certainly be an interesting day when that happens. So, and we'll probably be talking about it then too, folks.
Yep. So I pulled up I put something in here, and there's a reason for it, and I'm trying to locate. My computer's running a little slow here for a moment, but let's see what if. No, it's not gonna. Computer is trolling here. There's a gentleman out of Finland who emailed us a week ago, and he said, look, I am a PhD student in biomechanics, and I am, let's see, I'm trying to figure out a topic for my senior thesis, and he was asking about a bunch of things that had been dismissed. And remember the Z article that we wrote about?
Yeah.
The Z joint angle. Why don't you just, while I'm trying to pull this up, why don't you go back into what that was, and then let's talk about a couple little things that are a bit of a boil on my butt when it comes to this topic.
Sure. So one of the articles we wrote a while ago that was pretty popular was talking about the Z angle, but more importantly, talking about hip extension and ankle dorsiflexion and how one of those should really be able to match or mirror the other. When we don't have enough of one, we'll usually have too much of the other, or sometimes we have neither of either, and then we're going to see gait changes. So requisitely, to walk normally, we need about 10 degrees of hip extension, 15 would be preferable, and the same amount of ankle dorsiflexion, even though ankle dorsiflexion should probably approach between 55 and 60 degrees, but it rarely does in a lot of individuals. We find in our office, and I think, Sean, you would agree, that 10 degrees seems to be about the symptom limiting factor. So folks that have 10 degrees or more of ankle dorsiflexion and 10 degrees or more of hip extension tend to have way fewer lower extremity problems and lower back problems as well than folks who have less than that. And that's sort of a clinical colloquialism that we've just sort of noted over time, but that's something that I'm always looking at, like how much ankle dorsiflexion do they have on the table? How much do they have when they're walking normally? And does it match hip extension? And a lot of times, if one of those things doesn't match, just by equalizing those two things, we don't fix people, but people become less symptomatic or asymptomatic. So we coined the term the Z angle, talking about, if you were to actually draw, lines between them, with the leg being the long leg of the Z, one angle should equal the other. So that's what the Z angle is all about.
Well, it came to light because there's been stuff out in the web on ankle dorsiflexion. It seems to be the big thing that everybody's trying to drive now, is more ankle dorsiflexion. And whether we're responsible for that or many sources, it really doesn't matter to me. But there are factors in these dialogues and in these articles and in these videos that I see, and no one is paying attention to the subtle nuances of these things, of pelvis mechanics? Are they into an anterior pelvic tilt? Is the knee diving into that medial or lateral frontal plane? Is the ankle dorsiflexion actually a product of foot pronation? What is the status of the foot mechanics? Are they forefoot varus? Are they valgus? What's the rear foot status? Do they have an equinus foot? Do they have a flexible deformity or a rigid deformity? And ultimately times I'm looking at these videos and I'm seeing that what they appear to be achieving is ankle dorsiflexion is actually just driving through a arch posture into pronation, excessively so in many cases. And that's not actually true ankle dorsiflexion. It may look like it because the tibia is progressing forward in that sagittal plane, but it's doing so at the corrupt, through the corruption of the actual ankle or the foot pronation factor. And so the dorsiflexion that you've obtained is actually a pathological movement pattern, which could create problems. And so if you start pairing up more hip extension now on what you think is ankle dorsiflexion, which is actually largely foot pronation, you're setting your client up for a lot of problem. And a lot of people have taken our shuffle walks and our windshield wipers and a lot of our exercises and are using them as a means to obtain more ankle dorsiflexion. But in their videos, I don't see the foot tripod being engaged correctly. I don't see pelvic posturing being addressed. So it's kind of like I said, a boil on my butt and a sore spot because it's once again people that don't have enough information are trying to absorb what they think is the right information and getting themselves into trouble and their clients into trouble. And it worries me because too many people are going on the internet and grabbing information that they think is helpful. And I appreciate and I admire the where it's coming from. But if it's not driving what you actually think it's driving, you're in trouble. And that brings back, once again, maybe for the third podcast in the last several, that Neil deGrasse Tyson quote that knowing enough to think that you're doing it right, but not enough to know that you're doing it wrong, really is something that we all need to look at. You know, we all think we know enough and we think we're doing the right thing, but often at some point down the road, someone calls us out and we realize, holy crap, I've been doing that wrong, or I didn't understand half of what I thought I did, and I've been making a lot of mistakes. So, you know, I just have seen some stuff recently, and I just thought I would bring it up so that maybe we can help some other people prevent some well-intended mistakes. So I don't know if you've been seeing these videos or not, but, you know, you probably have something to say about this, or maybe you don't.
No, I mean, I think that those are all super valid points. And again, this goes back to the consistency thing we were talking about. When you're checking somebody's ankle dorsiflexion and they're standing, obviously it's easy to look and see if they have rear, mid, or forefoot pronation occurring. When you're checking them on the table, sometimes it's not quite as apparent. So one of the things I like to do, and I'm not sure if you taught me this or if I learned this from somebody else, but what I'll do is I'll check ankle dorsiflexion with the foot neutral, then I'll invert the foot fully, then I'll evert the foot fully, and of course eversion is a component of pronation. And I'll compare the three of them, and are they relatively close or are they really far apart? When we invert the foot, we are sort of supinating the foot and we're locking a portion of that mid-tarsal articulation as well as a portion of the calcaneocuboid locking mechanism. And as a result of that, we can get, I think, a truer feeling of what it's like when we have a functional arch, or at least an arch in play, as to what's going on. A little harder to do with somebody standing. One of the simple things we do is I just have people extend their toes. It's not a perfect test, but what that'll do is help to fire some of the inverters of the foot. Mm-hmm. And help me to maintain somewhat of a functional arch. And then when I'm looking at hip extension, again, I'm looking at the angle of the hip compared to the body. If I'm doing that on the table with the person face down, I've got one hand on their sacroiliac joint, and I'm extending their hip with the opposite, looking at that to make sure I can feel if they're having anterior pelvic tilt or what's going on there. But again, remember, these are just functional tests that give us information that we need to correlate with what we're actually seeing the patient do during the gait cycle, as well as what their chief complaint is. And, we bring these points up not because we're trying to be critical, but just because we want you guys to not be, make some of the same mistakes that we've made. And, a comment that you made just a minute ago really hit home about, not knowing enough to know that we were doing it wrong. And I think back to when you and I started this journey, many years ago. And, we were both sort of young, fresh biomechanists going out to cure the world. And there were a lot of things that we did that, or learned and even taught in lectures that it was like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. That was like so far off compared to what we know now. But we, you grow, you mature, you learn as you're going through, and hopefully you don't make the same mistakes, or you help people to not make the same ones as they're going through. But yeah.
On this topic, I'm reminded of about a year ago, we were discussing ankle dorsiflexion, and just because someone has it available on the table or during your examination or assessment doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have that available in their gait cycle. And it may just be as simple as they don't have enough perceived skill or stability or proprioception in order to allow that tibia to progress across that talus. They may not feel that the foot is stable enough, and so they may search for more foot on the ground through pronation in order to feel stable to stand on that foot. And in those cases, the foot may actually show more dorsiflexion, apparent dorsiflexion through foot pronation, which is really not what you're trying to get through the ankle mortise joint. On the other side of that coin, they may not have any or sufficient ankle dorsiflexion because they're locking out and finding stability through more calf tension and Achilles load, which thus obviously tightens up that posterior component or compartment, inhibiting the anterior compartment and locking out ankle rocker there and giving them a premature heel rise. So just because your client shows ankle dorsiflexion on the table and during your exam, and maybe even during your MOBs and your homework exercises, doesn't mean it's going to show up on the table. And it might just be because they have a terrible pattern. It may, that is just written over and over again into their nervous system, and it's a plastic pattern at this point. Or they just might not have the perceived stability in order to obtain the proper mobility to have it show up in their gait cycle. And their homework may not drive it. It may drive the motor pattern, but it might not drive it actually sufficiently enough to show up in the gait cycle. So keep in mind, it really does become that complicated in some clients. Certainly those are the ones where you pound your head on the wall and you're frustrated because you can see it, it's available, but they're not using it because they can't get to it. And those are frustrating cases, but those are the ones that put hair on your chest and deepen your voice and make you sound a little bit more manly or, strong womanly. So, this is where the game gets tough, and this is the stuff that frustrates Ivo and I. So if you're there and you're frustrated, hey, join the club. We're sitting on the bus right there with you. So just something to think about.
We use the expression in the office all the time. The car is parked in the driveway, but you don't have the keys.
Yeah.
Meaning that you've got it available to you, but you just don't know how to use it. And I think that we spend a great deal of our time educating people in how to utilize what it is that they don't have. And sometimes that's through exercise. Sometimes that's through drills. Sometimes it's through functional activities, that kind of stuff to get them to actually, get it and get through there. But nope, we're right there with you, and we share we're feeling your pain, and we've definitely been there. And, sometimes we get those cases that are just frustrating and there's just nothing that we can seem to be able to do. As far as that. And sometimes that's us, and sometimes that's the patient, and sometimes it's a combination of, the two factors.
Well, absolutely. And I'm very sympathetic to the groups of folks who are particularly coaches. Personal trainers, I think, need to be held to a slightly higher standard because they may just be working with one client, in which case they can vary the actual assessment and the homework and the exercises and hone in on some of these more intricate variables. But I feel very, very sympathetic towards the coaches who have 10, 20, 50 athletes, and they're trying to optimize all of them. But unfortunately, you have 50 different bodies with 50 different types of mechanics and skill levels and endurance and strength and all of those things. And I think it's really a mistake to ask them all to do the same homework, because there are some who might, for example, if we're using dorsiflexion and you're giving our tried and true shuffle gait homework and you give it to the whole team, some of those guys are going to actually benefit from it, because they need more ankle dorsiflexion. And by getting into that anterior compartment and forcing some dorsiflexion and throwing some skills through that activity, may get those, let's say 25% or maybe even 50% to a better place functionally and allow them to get to better hip extension and more glutes. But there's going to be some of those guys who don't need any more ankle dorsiflexion. And in fact, they might actually need more hip training in order to obtain more at the top end of the kinetic chain before they can start to task out any more at the lower part of the chain through the shuffle walks. And so that's an order problem, or I like to call a recipe problem. In that case, you maybe have to put the frosting in the bowl before the eggs and the flour and everything else in order to get this to come out right. But there are some clients that driving more ankle dorsiflexion will be pathologic to them and actually drive them into an injury, even though it would make sense that more ankle dorsiflexion is probably going to be better for their body. But in some of their cases, from the variables that we've talked about, it might actually be pathologic. Even though the intention is good and the thoughts are good, it could create some injuries just as easily as a pathologic movement pattern, because for them, it might be a pathologic movement pattern because of the things we talked about. They may not have enough mobility. They might not have enough stability. They might have some torsional variances, etc. So for coaches that coach masses of people, please understand that if you're having everybody do the same homework, it might actually hurt a couple people, and your good intentions might actually be part of the actual injury numbers in your clients or on your team that year. So just keep in mind, if you're trying to cookbook it for everybody, you're probably making some mistakes.
There's not one recipe.
That's right. But we should probably save this foot drop one for next time. And what do you think? We're 55 minutes into this already?
I think we've ranted on and off quite enough for one day.
I
we'll
think
give
so too.
people's brains a break for a couple weeks.
Yeah. Well, this one's probably going to be up at the end of the year there for most of you. And we want to wish you all a happy new year and some happy holidays. We're doing this a couple weeks prior to. But if we aim right, we should hit the mark pretty close to New Year's here. So we hope you all had a great holiday season. And we hope you have a good new year. We will be back in 2017 with more facts, fun, and follies here, if you will. And it's been a good year. I've learned a lot from you, and I am very appreciative of you and thankful that you show up here every week with me, and we write about the Gate Guys stuff, and we talk to people. And so thanks for a good year, bud.
Hey, the feeling is mutual. I learn a ton from you and from writing and researching, and it's an honor to be able to teach with you.
Absolutely. Heartfelt in return. Well, on that note, Sean Allen in Chicago.
Ivor Whirl up in Dillon, Colorado. We will see you in the shoe aisle.